They smiled differently after the funeral. Softer voices, gentle touches on my arm, invitations I had never received before. For the first time in years, they asked how I was doing, and they listened, or at least pretended to. I knew why it was happening. The inheritance paperwork wasn't complete, and they needed my signature. They spoke about family unity, about healing, about honoring the person we had lost. They told me I deserved peace, that we all did. I nodded. I stayed quiet. I let them believe their kindness had finally reached me. What they didn't know was that silence doesn't mean surrender. Sometimes it means preparation. The day I signed those papers, they thought the story was over. They thought years of neglect, manipulation, and quiet cruelty could be erased with a few warm words and a pen in my hand. They never asked if I had read everything carefully. They never imagined I would leave anything behind. They only realized the truth when my note was read aloud. Before the story continues, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Leave your city or country, and your local time in the comments. And if stories about quiet endurance and delayed justice speak to you, please consider subscribing. It truly helps this channel reach others who need to hear them. I wasn't born invisible. I became that way slowly, through years of small exclusions that no one ever apologized for, because no one ever acknowledged them. In my family, invisibility didn't come from cruelty shouted out loud. It came from quiet decisions made without me in the room, and eventually without me in mind. We lived in a comfortable American suburb, the kind with trimmed lawns and neighbors who waved but never really knew you. On the surface, everything looked stable. Two-car garage, holiday dinners that looked good in photos, conversations about investments, college plans, retirement accounts. Money was never discussed as something scarce, just something carefully allocated. And I learned early that I wasn't part of those calculations. My older sibling had their college tuition paid in full, not once but twice undergraduate and graduate school. My cousins received help with down payments, weddings, even start-over funds when relationships didn't work out. When I asked for help buying textbooks during my second year of college, I was told it wasn't the right time. When I worked 2 jobs to cover rent after graduation, no one noticed. Or maybe they did and it just didn't matter. I learned to keep my needs small. I learned not to expect. I learned that gratitude was safer than disappointment. The only person who never treated me like an inconvenience was my grandmother. She wasn't affectionate in the way movies portray grandmothers. She didn't hug often. She didn't say I love you easily. But she watched. She listened. When everyone else spoke over me, she let me finish my sentences. When I stayed quiet at family gatherings, she didn't force conversation, but she made space. Sometimes late at night, when the house had gone quiet, she would sit across from me at the kitchen table and ask simple questions. How work was going, whether I was sleeping enough, if I felt tired. Once, when I admitted that I did, she nodded and said, "People mistake endurance for weakness. Don't you ever do that." I didn't know then how much that sentence would matter. When she passed away, the house filled with people who hadn't shown up for her in years. Suddenly everyone had stories. Everyone had regrets. Everyone cried. I stood near the back of the room during the service, hands folded, listening to versions of my grandmother that felt incomplete. No one asked how I was holding up. No one expected me to say anything meaningful. That was fine. I was used to being background noise. The first formal conversation about her estate happened a few days later, in the same dining room, where I had learned to make myself smaller. A lawyer sat at the head of the table, papers neatly stacked, voice calm and professional. He explained the structure of the estate properties accounts, a trust established years ago. The numbers were large enough to change lives, and everyone leaned forward when he spoke. I stayed back listening. Then he paused, as if choosing his words carefully. "There are a few procedural steps still required before distribution," he said. "Some documents that need to be acknowledged by all listed parties." He looked directly at me. "For one portion of the estate," he continued, "your signature is required before anything can move forward." The room went quiet in a way I had never experienced before. It wasn't awkward. It wasn't tense. It was alert, as if everyone had just realized there was a variable they hadn't accounted for. I nodded slowly, even though my heart had started to pound. I hadn't expected to be named in anything significant. I had spent years preparing myself to be excluded, to be told I would understand, to be reminded that fairness didn't always mean equality. After the lawyer left, no one confronted me directly. Instead, the tone shifted. Conversations softened. Smiles lingered longer. People who hadn't texted me in years suddenly checked in. My aunt asked if I was eating properly. A cousin offered to help me with errands. My sibling suggested we spend some time together, just the two of us, like old times. It would have been comforting if it hadn't felt so rehearsed. As the days passed, I replayed old memories with new clarity, being told there wasn't space for me on family trips, being reminded again and again that I was independent, as if that explained why no one ever showed up when I struggled. I remembered standing in the kitchen at 19, listening to laughter from the living room, realizing no one had noticed I'd left the table. So when they treated me kindly now, I didn't feel grateful. I felt cautious. They talked about unity, about how estates could tear families apart if people weren't careful, about how my grandmother would have wanted peace. They never said the word inheritance directly when speaking to me. They spoke in euphemisms as if clarity might scare me away. I listened. I nodded. I didn't argue. That night alone in my small apartment miles away from the family home, I opened the folder the lawyer had given me. I read every page slowly. Not because I understood everything, but because I had learned what it cost to assume I wasn't important enough to read carefully. I noticed my name more than once. I noticed dates that didn't align with conversations I remembered. I noticed language that felt deliberately vague, carefully constructed to sound fair while leaving room for interpretation. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider something unsettling, the possibility that my silence had been mistaken for ignorance, that the role they had assigned me, quiet, grateful, compliant, might finally work against them. I didn't feel angry. That surprised me. What I felt was steady, grounded, as if years of being overlooked had trained me to observe without reacting. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a message from my sibling. "Let's handle this smoothly," it read. Grandma would have wanted us united. I stared at the screen for a long time. They used her name like a shield, like something sacred they could hold up to protect themselves from accountability. "You don't get to speak for her," I whispered to the empty room. But I didn't reply. I didn't correct them. I didn't explain myself. I stayed quiet, because this time silence wasn't something done to me. It was something I chose. The kindness didn't arrive all at once. It unfolded in layers, careful and measured, like something practiced. At first it was small gestures, a text message here, a casual check-in there. Nothing that could be questioned. Nothing that could be confronted. Just enough to suggest concern, without ever acknowledging the years that came before it. My aunt started calling in the evenings. She never used to call unless she needed something. Now she asked how work was going, whether I was sleeping enough, if I was taking care of myself. She laughed softly when I answered, as if reassured by the sound of my voice, as if that was all she needed. My cousin invited me to dinner, just the two of us. We had never spent time alone before. Over pasta and polite conversation, she told me how hard this transition had been on everyone, how stressful legal matters could be, how grateful she was that I was being so understanding. Understanding. The word followed me everywhere. My siblings' approach was more direct, but wrapped in familiarity. They asked to meet for coffee, suggested a place we used to go to years ago. When we sat down, they spoke about memories, about growing up together, about how family had to stick together during difficult times. They never mentioned the paperwork. They never mentioned the signature. They didn't have to. It hovered between us, unspoken but undeniable. I listened. I always listened. What struck me most wasn't what they said it was, what they avoided. No one apologized. No one acknowledged how I had been treated. No one said my name with regret. Their kindness wasn't about me. It was about relief. About ensuring nothing complicated stood in the way of what they believed was already theirs. At night when I lay awake, I replayed the conversations in my head. The careful phrasing, the pauses, the way their eyes searched my face for reassurance. I realized they weren't worried I would say no. They were worried I would ask questions. That realization changed something inside me. A week later, the family gathered again at the house. This time it wasn't for legal matters. It was framed as a dinner, a chance to reconnect, a step toward healing. I almost didn't go, but I knew absence could be interpreted as resistance, and resistance would invite pressure. So I went. The table was set carefully, too carefully. My favorite dish was placed directly in front of me, something no one had remembered in years. Compliments came easily, too easily. I was told I looked well, that I seemed calm, that my grandmother would be proud of how I was handling everything. I kept my voice even. I thanked them. I didn't challenge the narrative. Halfway through dinner, someone mentioned how complicated estates could become if people got emotional. Another added that lawyers often dragged things out unnecessarily, costing families time and money. The message was clear: without ever being spoken, delays were undesirable. Cooperation was expected. I noticed how often eyes flicked toward me when these comments were made. How conversations paused just long enough for me to respond. I didn't. I focused on my plate, on my breathing, on the weight of everything unsaid. After dessert, my aunt pulled me aside. Her voice was low, almost conspiratorial. "You're doing the right thing," she said. "Your grandmother trusted you. We all do." The words landed heavily. Trust used this way felt less like belief and more like obligation. That night I went home and pulled out the documents again. I read them with fresh eyes, informed now by the performance I had just witnessed. The more I read, the clearer it became that the estate wasn't as straightforward as it had been presented. Certain assets were bundled together in ways that favored speed over scrutiny. Certain clauses referenced amendments I had never been told about. I made notes in the margins. I highlighted phrases. I didn't rush. A few days later, the lawyer contacted me directly. His tone was courteous but firm. "We'd like to schedule the signing," he said. "The family is eager to move forward." I told him I needed time. He paused just briefly before agreeing. That pause confirmed what I already suspected: my hesitation mattered. The pressure intensified after that. Messages became more frequent. The warmth sharpened into urgency. I was reminded how stressful this process had been for everyone else, how delays could complicate things, how grateful they were that I was being reasonable. No one asked what I needed. One evening, my sibling called unexpectedly. Their voice was tight, controlled. "Is there something wrong?" they asked. "You've been quiet." I almost laughed at that. Quiet was the only version of me they had ever accepted. "I'm just reading everything carefully," I said. There was silence on the other end of the line. Not the comfortable kind. "Well," they replied slowly, "there's really no reason to overthink it. It's all standard." Standard. Another word meant to end conversation. "I understand," I said, and ended the call. That night, I reached out to a lawyer of my own. Not someone connected to the family. Not someone invested in speed. I explained the situation simply, without emotion. I sent copies of the documents. When we met, he didn't rush me. He didn't reassure me unnecessarily. He read. He asked questions. He pointed out inconsistencies I had felt but hadn't fully understood. "You're right to be cautious," he said finally. "There are implications here that haven't been explained to you." For the first time since my grandmother passed, I felt something loosen in my chest. Not anger, not relief, validation. I didn't tell my family about that meeting. I didn't need to. Their kindness continued, but it had changed. It was sharper now, less patient. They were no longer pretending I didn't exist. They were waiting for me to disappear back into the role they were comfortable with. I didn't. I stayed quiet. I stayed observant, because I was beginning to understand something they hadn't considered. Their performance depended on my silence, and silence, when chosen carefully, could be powerful. Once the pressure became visible, it never fully retreated. It simply learned to disguise itself better. After I told them I was reading everything carefully, the tone of their kindness shifted. It didn't disappear because that would have revealed too much, but it tightened like a smile held for too long. Every interaction carried a faint edge, now a reminder that patience had limits. My aunt stopped asking how I was sleeping and started asking when I thought I'd be ready. My cousin's invitations turned into reminders about deadlines. My sibling, once nostalgic and warm, began to sound managerial, as if this were a project we needed to finish, rather than a family grieving someone we loved. Still, no one raised their voice. No one demanded anything outright. They didn't have to. They relied on something they believed they understood about me, that I avoided conflict, that I hated being the reason for tension, that I would eventually comply just to restore quiet. They were right about one thing. I hated tension. But what they didn't understand was that I hated erasure more. The messages came almost daily now. Sometimes they were framed as concern, sometimes as practicality. "Lawyers charge by the hour," one text read. "Dragging this out only hurts," everyone said another. The words everyone and family were used interchangeably, as if my interests and theirs had always been aligned. I responded politely, briefly, never defensively. "I'm reviewing. I'll let you know. I appreciate your patience." Patience. A word they hadn't extended to me when I needed it. At night, alone in my apartment, I spread the documents across my kitchen table. I read them again and again, this time with notes from my own lawyer beside me. He had walked me through the language, carefully translating legal phrasing into consequences. If I signed without conditions, I would waive certain rights permanently. If I signed as is, I would be acknowledging amendments I had never agreed to. If I signed in good faith, it would be assumed I had been fully informed. "You don't have to fight," my lawyer had said during our second meeting. "But you do need to be deliberate." Deliberate. The word stayed with me. I thought about my grandmother then, not as the figure everyone else talked about, but as the woman who had watched me quietly for years, who had never intervened loudly, never corrected anyone publicly, yet somehow always knew more than she let on. I wondered how much she had seen, how much she had anticipated. The thought didn't make me emotional. It made me steady. At the next family gathering, the pressure became more coordinated. We met at the house again under the pretense of sorting through belongings. But the real purpose was obvious. Everyone was there. Everyone had an opinion. And everyone seemed to be waiting for me to say something definitive. At one point, my uncle leaned back in his chair and said casually, "These things work best when people don't complicate them." Another added, "Dragging lawyers into family matters usually just creates resentment." I noticed how quickly they spoke after one another like lines in a script. I noticed how the room quieted afterward, how a tension settled on me. I kept my voice calm. "I agree," I said. "Clarity matters." They relaxed slightly at that, mistaking agreement for surrender. Later, my sibling cornered me in the hallway. Their voice was low, controlled. "You're making people nervous," they said. "No one wants this to turn ugly." "I don't either," I replied. "Then why won't you just sign?" The question was simple. The answer was not. "I will," I said carefully, "when I'm ready." They searched my face looking for something: fear, guilt, hesitation. I gave them nothing. That night, after everyone left, I drove home in silence. Miles passed without music, without distraction. Just the hum of the road and my own breathing. I realized something during that drive that surprised me. I wasn't afraid of what would happen if I signed. I was afraid of what would happen if I didn't protect myself now. The next morning, I met my lawyer again. We went over options, not confrontational ones, not dramatic ones. Just lawful, precise steps that respected the structure already in place. "There's a way to sign without surrendering," he explained. "But it has to be done correctly, and it has to be documented." That was when the idea of the note took shape, not as a weapon, but as a record. A statement of intent. Something that couldn't be ignored or reinterpreted later. I didn't tell anyone about it. In the days that followed, my family's patience wore thinner. The kindness became more brittle. Texts went unanswered longer. Smiles felt forced. At one point, my aunt said, "I hope this isn't about old feelings. We're all trying our best here." Old feelings. As if neglect expired if it wasn't addressed in time. "I know," I said. And I did know. I knew exactly what they were trying to do. They wanted me to feel unreasonable, emotional, disruptive. They wanted me to doubt myself enough to stop asking questions. I didn't. Instead, I prepared quietly. I wrote drafts. I revised. I checked language. I asked my lawyer to review it, not to make it aggressive, but to make it unambiguous. Every word mattered. Every phrase had a purpose. When the date for the signing was finally set, the relief on their faces was immediate. The warmth returned suddenly and conveniently. Compliments resurfaced. Jokes were made. Someone even hugged me, something that hadn't happened in years. They thought the tension was over. I let them think that, because by then I understood something they didn't. Pressure only works when you're afraid of what happens if you resist. And I wasn't afraid anymore. Once the date for the signing was set, everything moved faster, too fast. The family's relief was visible, almost physical. Shoulders relaxed. Voices softened again. The tension they had carried for weeks seemed to dissolve overnight, replaced by a confidence that unsettled me more than the pressure ever had. They believed the outcome was inevitable now. My sibling texted me the morning after the date was confirmed. "Thank you for being reasonable," the message read. "This means a lot to everyone." Reasonable. As if my role in this story had always been to make things easier for them. I didn't reply. Instead, I drove to my lawyer's office with a notebook full of questions. We went through the documents line by line, slower this time, more deliberate. He explained how certain phrases could be interpreted in court, how timing mattered, how intent mattered even more. "What they're relying on," he said, tapping one page gently, "is that you won't contest anything later. That once this is signed, you'll step back into the background." I nodded. That part made sense. It aligned perfectly with how they had always seen me. He pointed to a clause buried deep in the paperwork. It referenced an addendum filed years after the trust was created, an amendment that shifted control in subtle but significant ways. Control over timing, control over distribution, control over disclosure. Did anyone explain this to you? He asked. No, I said, honestly. He leaned back in his chair. That's important. For the first time, I saw the structure clearly, not just the numbers, not just the assets, but the design. This wasn't a sudden scramble after my grandmother's death. It was something that had been prepared quietly, incrementally, with the assumption that no one would challenge it, especially not me. Over the next few days, I asked my lawyer to pull records, filing dates, correspondence, anything that could establish a timeline. What emerged wasn't explosive, but it was revealing. Decisions made without my knowledge. Notifications sent to addresses I hadn't lived at in years. Language that suggested compliance without confirming it. None of it was illegal on its own, but together it painted a picture of convenience over consent. I didn't confront my family. There was no point. Confrontation would only trigger defensiveness, and defensiveness would lead to closed ranks. I wasn't trying to expose them yet. I was trying to protect myself. At home, I began drafting the note. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional. It didn't accuse or threaten. It simply stated facts, my understanding of the agreement, the conditions under which I was signing, and the rights I was explicitly reserving. It referenced the specific clauses that concerned me, the dates of the amendments, and my expectation of transparency moving forward. I rewrote it several times. Each version became cleaner, quieter, more precise. This isn't about saying more, my lawyer reminded me. It's about saying exactly enough. As the signing approached, my family's behavior shifted again. The warmth returned in full force. Invitations were extended. Compliments flowed. Someone joked about how nice it would be to finally close this chapter. I watched them carefully now. The way conversations stopped when I entered the room. The way people spoke around me instead of to me. The way relief crept into their voices when they thought I wasn't listening. At dinner one night, my aunt raised her glass and said, "To moving forward." Everyone echoed the sentiment. Glasses clinked. Smiles spread. I lifted mine last. To clarity, I said, no one noticed the difference. The night before the signing, I barely slept. Not from anxiety, but from awareness. My mind replayed moments from years past, times when I had swallowed words, accepted explanations that didn't sit right, trusted people who hadn't earned it. I realized how much energy I had spent trying not to be difficult. That version of me felt distant now. Not gone, but quieter, watching. The morning of the signing, I dressed simply. Nothing that would draw attention. Nothing that would suggest conflict. I placed the documents in a folder, my note sealed inside, exactly where it needed to be. When I arrived at the office, everyone was already there. The lawyer greeted us professionally. Papers were laid out, pens aligned. It felt ceremonial, almost routine. My family greeted me with smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. Someone squeezed my shoulder. Someone else whispered, "Almost done." I sat down without responding. As the lawyer began to explain the process, I noticed how little anyone was listening. They had already moved on mentally, already spending what they believed was secured. I wondered if any of them had considered that I might have done the same kind of preparation they had. Probably not. When the moment came, the lawyer slid the document toward me. The room went quiet, not tense but expectant. This was the moment they had been waiting for. The moment they believed would confirm every assumption they had ever made about me. I picked up the pen. I signed. No hesitation, no visible emotion, just a steady hand and a deliberate motion. Relief washed across the room like a wave. Someone exhaled loudly. Someone else smiled openly for the first time in weeks. They thought it was over. They didn't see the note yet. They didn't ask about it. They didn't think to. Because they had mistaken my silence for simplicity. I closed the folder and handed it back to the lawyer. He accepted it without comment, placing it with the others. As the meeting continued, conversation resumed. People relaxed. Plans were made. Futures discussed. I sat quietly listening. Because I knew something they didn't, the most important words I had written weren't on the page they had just watched me sign. They were waiting to be read. The days between the signing and the official review felt unreal, like time had thinned out around me. Everyone else moved as if the future had already been decided. I moved as if nothing had happened at all. My family acted lighter. Messages became casual again, almost celebratory. Someone sent a group text about planning a short trip once everything settled. Another joked about finally being able to breathe. They spoke as though the paperwork had closed a door behind us, sealing the past neatly away. I stayed quiet. That silence unsettled them more than I expected. When people believe a problem is solved, they expect gratitude, relief, some visible sign of closure. My lack of reaction didn't fit the story they were telling themselves. Still, they didn't question it. They had never learned to ask me questions that mattered. I returned to my routine. Work, groceries, evenings alone with the hum of the refrigerator and the city outside my window. From the outside, nothing had changed. Inside, everything had shifted. I thought often about my grandmother during that time. Not in a sentimental way, but in fragments. Her hands folded neatly on the table. The way she paused before answering questions, as if weighing more than just words. I realized now how deliberate she had always been. How much she had understood about people, about silence, about timing. I wondered if she had anticipated this moment. If she had known that the person everyone underestimated would be the one holding the balance, however briefly. A few days later, the lawyer called to confirm the date when all documents would be formally reviewed and recorded. It would be routine, he said. Just a final procedural step. Public, but not dramatic. Standard practice. That word again. I agreed to attend. When I told my family, the relief was immediate. My siblings sent a message full of gratitude and reassurance. "I'm really glad this is behind us," they wrote. "We can finally focus on being a family again." I read it twice before setting my phone down. Being a family had never required my signature before. The night before the review, I took the note out one last time. I read it slowly, checking each line. It was simple, clear, almost understated. There was no accusation, no emotional language. Just a record of my understanding, my conditions, and my intent. It didn't raise its voice. It didn't need to. I sealed it again and placed it carefully back into the folder. Sleep came easily that night. That surprised me. The day of the review, the setting was different from the signing. Larger, more formal. A conference room with long tables and neutral walls. The kind of space designed to make emotions feel out of place. A few additional legal representatives were present. People who hadn't attended the earlier meeting. People who had no history with us, no emotional investment. My family filled the room with familiarity. They greeted one another warmly, confident now. Jokes were exchanged. Someone commented on how smoothly things had gone. I noticed how little attention they paid to the lawyers, setting up how they spoke over explanations already certain of the outcome. I took my seat near the end of the table. The review began as expected. Documents were referenced, signatures confirmed, pages flipped. Everything moved efficiently, professionally. My name was mentioned several times, each time followed by a brief pause as if waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. Then the lawyer reached the section that included my materials. He adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "There is an attached statement," he said, looking down at the folder. "Provided at the time of signing." The room quieted, not completely, but enough. My sibling leaned back unconcerned. My aunt glanced toward me briefly, then away. The lawyer began to read. At first, no one reacted. The language was measured, almost dry. References to clauses, clarifications of consent, statements of reservation. It sounded like what it was, a legal record. Then the meaning began to settle. The lawyer paused, reading the same sentence again, more carefully this time. He looked up. "This note," he said slowly, "alters the interpretation of the signature provided." The room shifted. Chairs creaked. Someone laughed nervously, as if assuming this was a misunderstanding. "What do you mean?" my sibling asked. The lawyer didn't respond immediately. He continued reading. As the words filled the room, the confidence drained from their faces. They began to understand, not all at once, but in fragments, that the signature they had celebrated wasn't unconditional, that the silence they had relied on had contained intention. "This is standard," one of them said quickly. "Isn't it?" Another lawyer at the table shook his head slightly. "No," he said. "It's precise." The word hung in the air. Questions followed, confused ones, defensive ones. My family spoke over one another now, voices rising, composure slipping. They looked to the lawyers for reassurance. They looked to me for explanation. I gave neither. The lead attorney raised his hand gently. "We'll need to review this carefully," he said. "But it is valid, and it does change how the agreement functions." "What does that mean for us?" my aunt asked, her voice sharper than before. "It means," he replied, choosing his words, "that certain distributions cannot proceed as previously planned, and certain disclosures will be required." The room felt smaller suddenly, air thicker. I sat still, hands folded, eyes down. Not because I was afraid, but because there was nothing left for me to say. I had said everything already in the only language that mattered to them. For the first time in my life, my silence wasn't being filled in for me. It wasn't being interpreted as consent or confusion. It stood on its own. The meeting adjourned without resolution. Lawyers gathered documents. Dates were mentioned. Follow-up scheduled. My family filed out slowly, stunned, their earlier confidence replaced by something brittle and uncertain. As I stood to leave, my sibling reached for my arm. "Why didn't you tell us?" they asked, their voice low, urgent. I looked at them then, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with clarity. "You never asked," I said. And for once I didn't stay to soften the moment. The silence after that meeting lingered longer than I expected. It followed me out of the building, into the parking lot, and all the way home. It wasn't the quiet I had lived with for years, the kind that erased you. This one was heavy charged, full of things finally being understood too late. My phone buzzed before I even started the engine. Calls, messages, missed calls layered on top of one another. I didn't answer any of them. That night I sat alone in my apartment and replayed the moment my sibling had grabbed my arm. Not the words they'd said, but the tone, the confusion, the disbelief. For the first time, they weren't speaking down to me or around me. They were speaking to me as someone who had disrupted their certainty. That realization didn't feel like victory. It felt like gravity shifting. The next morning, the family group chat exploded. Questions flew. Accusations followed. Someone suggested the lawyers had misunderstood. Someone else implied I had been misled. No one suggested they had overlooked me on purpose. I scrolled through the messages, slowly, carefully. I read every word. I didn't respond. By noon, the tone changed. "Can we talk? There's been a misunderstanding. This doesn't have to get complicated." Complicated. The word had returned, now aimed directly at me. I agreed to meet my sibling later that day, not at the house, not in private, but at a neutral place. A quiet cafe downtown, open public, where voices carried and walls listened. I didn't want this conversation to dissolve into emotion or intimidation. They arrived early. When I walked in, they stood restless, eyes scanning my face as if trying to find the version of me they remembered. The one who apologized first, the one who yielded. It wasn't there. "What was that?" they asked as soon as we sat down. "No greeting, no preamble." "A clarification," I said. "You blindsided us," they snapped. "You could have said something." I took a breath. I did. In writing. They stared at me, frustration flaring. "You know what I mean." "Yes," I said. "And you know why I didn't." That stopped them. Just for a moment. They leaned back, exhaling sharply. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." I nodded. "That's what you said when I asked for help with tuition. When I asked for time. When I asked to be included." "That's not fair," they said quickly. "No," I replied. "It's accurate." The words landed between us, solid and undeniable. They opened their mouth, then closed it again. "You're risking everything," they said finally. "Do you really want to tear the family apart over this?" There it was. The familiar threat dressed up as concern. "I'm not tearing anything apart," I said calmly. "I'm refusing to be erased." They looked away, then jaw tight. For a moment I saw something like uncertainty cross their face. But it didn't last. "This won't end well," they warned. "It already didn't," I said. We parted without resolution. Over the next few days, the pressure escalated, but this time it was louder. Lawyers reached out. Clarifications were requested. Meetings were proposed. My family's patience evaporated, replaced by irritation and thinly veiled resentment. I stayed anchored to my routine. I met with my lawyer. We reviewed responses. We prepared documentation. Everything moved forward through proper channels, now stripped of family language and emotional leverage. That was when the letters arrived. Formal notices. Requests for disclosures. Requirements triggered by the conditions I had documented. Assets that had been assumed settled were suddenly paused. Accounts that had been planned around were now under review. The process slowed, and with it control shifted. My family wasn't used to that. Another meeting was scheduled. Larger this time. More formal. A review with additional legal oversight. People with authority, who hadn't been part of the earlier discussions, people who didn't know our history and didn't care. When we gathered again, the atmosphere was different. No jokes, no warmth, just tension layered thickly across the room. The lead attorney spoke first, summarizing the situation. He referenced my note, the clauses it activated, the obligations it imposed. He spoke plainly without judgment. "This was done correctly," he said, "and it stands." Someone interrupted him. My uncle's voice raised. "This was manipulation." The attorney didn't react. "It was documentation." My aunt tried next. She knew what she was doing. "Yes," the attorney replied. "That's the point." Eyes turned toward me, some angry, some shocked, some pleading. I kept my gaze steady. "What do you want?" my sibling asked suddenly. "What is this really about?" I considered the question carefully. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because I wanted to give it honestly. "I want transparency," I said. "I want acknowledgement. And I want what I was legally entitled to, not what you decided I deserved." The room fell quiet. One of the external lawyers cleared his throat. "Based on the trust's original structure," he said, "there are assets that must now be reevaluated. Some distributions may change." That was the moment everything tipped. Voices rose. Objections followed. Someone accused the process of being unfair. Another blamed the lawyers. Another blamed me. Through it all, I stayed silent. Because this time, silence wasn't weakness. It was restraint. Eventually, the authority in the room asserted itself. The meeting was adjourned. Steps were outlined. Timelines set. Decisions deferred pending compliance. As we stood to leave, the dynamic had shifted completely. My family no longer looked at me as an obstacle to maneuver around. They looked at me as a factor they couldn't ignore. Outside, my sibling caught up to me again. "You've changed," they said quietly. I met their gaze. "No," I replied. "You're just seeing me clearly for the first time." I walked away before they could respond. Because the truth was, nothing about me had changed at all. Only the rules had. The fallout didn't come all at once. It arrived in waves, some loud, some quiet, all relentless. What surprised me most wasn't the anger. It was the panic. My family had always believed the system favored them. They understood money. They understood influence. They were comfortable navigating spaces where decisions happened behind closed doors. What they didn't understand was what happened when those doors stayed open, when documentation replaced persuasion. For the first time, they were being asked to explain themselves. Requests for records began arriving within days. Bank statements, correspondence, proof of notifications, the kind of paperwork no one pays attention to until it's demanded. The lawyers handling the review were thorough, methodical. They asked questions without emotion, without assumption. And my family didn't like that. I stayed mostly outside of it, responding only when required. Everything went through my lawyer. Every word measured. Every document logged. The noise stayed on their side of the process. Still, it reached me. My aunt left a voicemail late one night, her voice trembling between anger and disbelief. "I don't understand why you're doing this," she said. "We raised you better than this." I deleted it without replying. My cousin sent a message that started polite and ended accusatory. "You're punishing everyone for things that happened years ago," she wrote. "Is that really who you want to be?" I didn't answer that either. What none of them seemed to grasp was that this wasn't punishment. It was consequence, a concept they had never applied to themselves. Another meeting was scheduled, this one mandatory, this one formal. A review of preliminary findings. The setting was a downtown office I had never been to before. Neutral walls, security at the front desk, a sign-in sheet that asked for identification. We sat across from each other again, but the distance felt greater now. My family huddled together instinctively, whispering, scanning the room. I sat alone, hands folded, breathing steady. The lead attorney opened with a summary. "There are discrepancies," he said. "Not illegal, but relevant. Notifications that were incomplete. Amendments that weren't fully disclosed to all beneficiaries." My uncle scoffed. "That's technical." The attorney nodded. "Yes, law often is." A few documents were projected onto the screen. Dates, addresses, names. My name appeared more than once attached to assumptions rather than confirmations. "We also have reason to believe," the attorney continued, "that certain distributions were planned prior to final consent." The word "planned" landed heavily. "That's not true," my sibling said quickly. "We'll determine that," the attorney replied calmly. I watched their confidence fracture in real time, not shatter fracture. Small cracks spreading difficult to hide once you knew where to look. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't say much. I answered questions directly. Yes or no. Dates when I remembered them. Places where I hadn't been informed. I didn't embellish. I didn't accuse. That seemed to frustrate them more than any outburst could have. At one point, my sibling leaned forward. You're enjoying this, they said too loudly. The room went quiet. No, I said calmly. I'm enduring it, just like I always have. The attorney cleared his throat and moved the meeting forward. When it ended, no decisions were finalized, but the direction was clear. Additional oversight would remain. Certain assets would stay frozen pending compliance. Transparency was no longer optional. Outside, the air felt sharper. My family lingered, arguing among themselves now. Blame shifted quickly. One accused another of mishandling paperwork. Someone else insisted they had followed instructions. No one looked at me. I left without waiting. In the weeks that followed, the process continued. Slowly. Thoroughly. Exactly the way systems are designed to move when they aren't being rushed. I returned to my life. Work demanded my attention. Bills needed paying. Ordinary things grounded me in a way the drama couldn't. Some evenings exhaustion crept in, not from fear but from holding steady for so long. There were moments when doubts surfaced. Quiet ones. Late at night. Was it worth it? Would it have been easier to sign and disappear again? Then I would remember the kitchen table, the years of being overlooked, the way my grandmother had looked at me when she told me not to confuse endurance with weakness. That memory steadied me every time. Another meeting came. Then another. Each one peeled back more of the assumptions my family had relied on. Each one shifted the balance further away from certainty. Eventually, the question everyone had been avoiding was asked aloud. What happens now? The answer came from someone with no emotional investment, no history, no reason to soften the truth. Now the attorney said the estate is restructured according to the original intent and the conditions documented. Some parties will receive less than expected. Some may receive nothing at all. The room erupted. Voices overlapped. Objections flew. Someone stood abruptly. Another accused the process of being unfair, of punishing success, of rewarding disloyalty. I sat still. Because beneath the chaos, I felt something unfamiliar but solid taking shape. Not triumph, not revenge, balance. The meeting adjourned in disorder. As people gathered their things, my sibling approached me one last time. You could have stopped this, they said quietly. You could have let it go. I met their eyes. I did let it go, I said. Years ago. This is what happens after. They looked at me as if trying to understand something fundamental and failing. I walked away again, not because I had won, but because I no longer needed to stay. For the first time in my life, the story wasn't being written around me. It was moving forward with me, standing exactly where I belonged. By the time the next hearing was scheduled, the story no longer belonged to my family. It belonged to the process. That realization changed everything. The notice arrived by certified mail, heavy with formality. A date, a location, a list of attendees that extended beyond our familiar circle. Independent trustees, external counsel, a probate judge assigned to oversee compliance and final determinations. This was no longer a private negotiation disguised as a family matter. It was public, documented, irreversible. When I told my lawyer I would attend in person, he paused. You don't have to, he said. Your presence isn't required. I know, I replied. But I want to be there. Not to argue, not to confront, to witness. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, not imposing, just functional. Wood benches worn smooth by time. A quiet authority that didn't need to announce itself. I arrived early and took a seat near the back, away from my family, away from the lawyers. Alone by choice. They filed in together as they always had, instinctively grouping themselves, scanning the room for allies. When they saw me, a few of them stiffened. My sibling looked away. My aunt whispered something sharply. No one approached me. The judge entered without ceremony. Everyone stood. Everyone sat. Proceedings began. The judge spoke plainly, outlining the purpose of the hearing. Compliance, intent, distribution. Each word landed with weight. This wasn't about feelings. It wasn't about fairness as they defined it. It was about what had been written, what had been filed, and what had been withheld. The lead attorney summarized the findings so far. He referenced my note not as a surprise now, but as a turning point. He explained how it had triggered additional review, how that review had revealed gaps in disclosure, assumptions made without confirmation, and plans set in motion prematurely. My family's attorney responded. He spoke confidently at first, emphasizing good faith, misunderstanding complexity. He framed everything as procedural confusion rather than deliberate oversight. The judge listened without interruption. Then questions began. Direct ones. Why were certain notifications sent to outdated addresses? Why were amendments not acknowledged by all beneficiaries? Why were distributions discussed before final consent was obtained? Each question narrowed the room. Answers followed, but they were fragmented. One person deferred to another. Another blamed administrative error. Someone insisted they had followed guidance. The narrative fractured under scrutiny. When my name came up, the judge looked at me directly for the first time. "Do you wish to speak?" she asked. The room held its breath. I stood slowly, hands steady. Briefly, I said, "I didn't tell a story. I didn't list grievances. I didn't describe years of neglect. None of that mattered here. I reviewed the documents provided to me," I said. "I noted discrepancies and sought independent counsel. I documented my understanding and conditions at the time of signing. I did not obstruct the process. I clarified my consent." The judge nodded. "Thank you. That was it." I sat back down. The rest unfolded without me. The judge ruled methodically. Certain actions were deemed inappropriate. Certain assumptions invalid. The estate would be restructured according to the original trust language, with my documented conditions honored. Oversight would remain in place until compliance was verified. Then came the part no one had prepared for. Based on the findings, the judge said some parties' expected distributions will be adjusted, others will be suspended pending further review. The word suspended echoed. My family reacted instantly. Voices rose. Objections followed. The judge raised a hand and silence returned. "This is not punitive," she said. "It is corrective. Corrective." That single word seemed to drain the room of argument, because it reframed everything. This wasn't about punishment or reward. It was about restoring alignment between intent and outcome. The hearing ended shortly after. Instructions were issued. Deadlines set. The court adjourned. People stood, gathered papers, spoke in low, urgent voices. My family clustered again, faces tight, plans unraveling. I remained seated until the room began to empty. Outside, the hallway buzzed with activity. Lawyers spoke into phones. Assistants moved quickly. My siblings stood near a window, staring out at the street below. When they noticed me, they hesitated, then approached. "This didn't have to happen," they said quietly. I looked at them. Really looked. Not as my sibling, not as someone who had once overshadowed me, but as a person standing in the aftermath of their own assumptions. "It already had," I replied. "You just didn't see it yet." They shook their head. "You've changed everything." I considered that. "No," I said. "I changed one thing. I stopped disappearing." They didn't respond. I walked past them and out of the building, the afternoon light sharper than before. Cars moved. People hurried by, unaware that anything significant had happened inside those walls. For me, something had. Not because I had won, not because they had lost, but because an authority greater than all of us had looked at the facts and said out loud that my silence had never meant consent, and that my voice, when finally documented, mattered. For the first time, justice wasn't a feeling. It was a record. The ruling didn't end things the way movies suggest justice does. There was no dramatic collapse, no sudden confessions, no satisfying silence that followed a final verdict. Instead, there was paperwork, adjustments, consequences that arrived slowly, methodically, and without emotion. That was harder for them to accept. In the weeks after the hearing, the family dynamic shifted in subtle but permanent ways. Conversations didn't stop, they changed direction. People stopped speaking to me and began speaking about me. Through lawyers, through formal notices, through careful language designed to avoid responsibility. The trust was restructured as ordered. Oversight remained in place. Distributions that had once been spoken about casually were now subject to verification, documentation, and approval. What had been assumed as guaranteed was now conditional, and some of those conditions were never met. One afternoon, my lawyer called with an update. His voice was calm, professional. "They've completed the disclosures," he said. "The numbers don't align with what was originally anticipated." I knew what that meant before he explained it. Certain assets had been counted twice. Others had been planned against future valuations that never materialized. Some distributions were no longer possible without violating the trust's intent. "They're unhappy," he added unnecessarily. I thanked him and ended the call. Unhappy wasn't new to them. Accountability was. Another meeting followed. Smaller this time. Fewer voices. The energy was different, no longer combative but strained. People spoke carefully now, choosing words that couldn't be used against them later. The authority in the room didn't come from volume or confidence. It came from documentation. The attorney summarized the final adjustments. Some parties would receive less than expected. One would receive nothing at all. The reaction was immediate. "That's not fair," my aunt said, her voice cracking. The attorney didn't look up. "It's consistent," my uncle argued next. He spoke about effort, about contribution, about what he believed he deserved. The attorney listened, then responded with dates, figures, and clauses. The argument dissolved under its own weight. When it was over, the room felt hollow. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt distance. Outside, my cousin approached me. Her expression was tight, controlled. "You're really going to let this happen?" she asked. I met her gaze. "I didn't make it happen. You could have stopped it," she insisted. I thought about that for a moment. About all the times I had stopped things before. Stopped myself from asking, from objecting, from existing too loudly. "Yes," I said finally. "I could have." She looked at me as if that confirmed something ugly. I let her think that. Because the truth was simpler and harder to explain, stopping it would have meant erasing myself again. And I wasn't willing to do that anymore. The last confrontation came from my sibling. It happened unexpectedly in a parking lot outside another legal office. They approached me quickly, frustration barely contained. "You didn't have to push it this far," they said. I stayed where I was. "I didn't push," I replied. "I stood." They scoffed. "You stood and everything fell apart." I shook my head slowly. Everything that couldn't stand on truth fell apart. They looked at me, then really looked, and something in their expression shifted. Not anger, not regret. Recognition. "You were always quiet," they said softly. "I thought that meant you didn't care." I felt the weight of that sentence settle between us. "No," I said. It meant no one listened. They didn't respond. We stood there for a moment longer, two people bound by history but no longer by illusion. Then they turned away and I watched them go. The final paperwork arrived weeks later. Clean, precise, unemotional. My portion of the inheritance was confirmed modest compared to what others had once expected, but exactly what aligned with the trust's original structure and my grandmother's intent. I signed the last document without hesitation. This time no one watched. No one waited for my pen to touch paper. There was no performance to disrupt. When it was done, I sat alone in my apartment and let the quiet settle. Not the old quiet, the one that erased. This one was spacious, intentional. I thought about my grandmother again, about the way she had navigated that family without ever raising her voice, about how she had seen more than anyone realized. I wondered if she had known this would happen. If she had trusted that I would find my way to this moment, not through confrontation but through endurance sharpened by clarity. The money didn't change my life overnight. It wasn't meant to. What changed was something less tangible and far more permanent. For the first time, my presence had altered the outcome. Not because I demanded it, but because I refused to disappear. And in doing so, I had learned something that would stay with me long after the documents were filed away. Justice doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives quietly and stays. After the final paperwork was signed and filed, there was an unexpected pause, an empty space where urgency used to live. For weeks, my life had been structured around deadlines, meetings, and the low hum of tension that never quite faded. When that stopped, I didn't feel relief right away. I felt disoriented. The family didn't reach out. Not to argue, not to reconcile, not even to accuse. Silence settled between us, thick and deliberate. I recognized it immediately. It was the same silence I had lived inside for years, only now it wasn't mine alone. I returned to ordinary days, work emails, morning traffic, grocery lists. Small routines grounded me, reminding me that life didn't pause just because a long injustice had finally been addressed. Still, something had shifted beneath the surface. I noticed it in how I stood a little straighter, how decisions came easier, how I no longer rehearsed explanations in my head before speaking. There were consequences, of course. Family gatherings stopped including me, not that they had ever truly included me before. Holidays passed without invitations. Group chats went quiet, then disappeared entirely. I was no longer a background figure. I was an absence they couldn't comfortably ignore. At first, that hurt more than I expected. I had told myself I didn't need their approval, and that was true. But separation has a way of exposing old wounds before they heal. There were nights when memories surfaced without warning, laughter drifting from another room, decisions made without my input, kindness extended only when something was needed from me. I sat with those memories instead of pushing them away. One evening, my aunt sent a short message. No greeting, no apology. I hope you're satisfied. I stared at the words for a long time before typing a response. Then I deleted it. Whatever I might say would only invite another round of misunderstanding. Satisfaction wasn't the right word. Neither was victory. What I felt was alignment. A few days later, my lawyer called with a final update. The oversight had concluded. All conditions met. The estate closed. That chapter is officially done, he said. After we hung up, I sat in silence and let that settle. Done didn't mean erased. It meant complete. It meant no longer bleeding into everything else. I thought about what I would do next, not with the money, but with the freedom it represented. I paid off lingering debts. I set aside savings. I made practical choices. Nothing extravagant, nothing symbolic. Stability mattered more than display. The biggest change wasn't financial. It was internal. I noticed how often I had been bracing myself before conversations, before meetings, before asking for anything at all. That bracing softened. I trusted my instincts now. I didn't second-guess my right to exist in a space. Months passed. The intensity faded. The story became something I could remember without reliving. When people at work asked about my family, I answered simply, no bitterness, no performance. We're not close, I said. And that was enough. One afternoon, I visited my grandmother's grave alone. I hadn't gone since the hearing. I stood there quietly, hands folded, the wind brushing past like a breath. I didn't speak out loud. I didn't need to. I thought about the sentence she had given me years ago, about endurance and weakness. I understood it fully now. Endurance wasn't about surviving quietly forever. It was about knowing when quiet had done its job and when clarity needed to step in. As I walked away, I felt something loosen that I hadn't realized I was still carrying. Not resentment, expectation. The family I had wanted no longer existed. Maybe it never had. What existed now was the family I was building, in smaller, truer ways, friends who listened, colleagues who respected boundaries, a life that didn't require me to shrink. There were still moments of sadness. Healing isn't linear. But there was also peace. A kind that didn't depend on anyone else's behavior. Looking back, I realized that the note I had written wasn't just a legal document. It was a declaration to myself that my silence had meaning and my presence had weight. That I didn't need to raise my voice to be heard. I needed to be precise, honest, unwilling to disappear. The delayed justice didn't restore what had been lost. It did something better. It taught me how to stand. By the time the estate was officially closed, the story had already stopped feeling like a battle. What remained wasn't tension or relief, but clarity, the kind that settles slowly after everything loud has finished breaking. I didn't announce anything. I didn't update anyone. The final confirmation arrived in an email from my lawyer, brief and factual. The trust was executed according to the court's direction. Funds were transferred. Obligations concluded. Oversight ended. That was it. No one from my family reached out afterward. Not to apologize. Not to explain. Not even to argue. In a strange way, that silence was the most honest response I'd ever received from them. It confirmed something I had been circling around for years. Our connection had only existed when I was useful, quiet, or invisible. Without that role, there was nothing left to negotiate. I spent the first few weeks afterward doing very little. I went to work. I came home. I cooked simple meals. I let my mind wander without steering it toward the past. When thoughts surfaced, I didn't fight them. I noticed how different they felt now, less sharp, less demanding. One afternoon, I caught myself sitting on the couch, staring at nothing, and realized I wasn't replaying conversations anymore. I wasn't rewriting outcomes in my head. The loop had finally broken. That was when I understood the real ending had already happened. The money arrived quietly without ceremony. A number on a screen. Enough to stabilize my life, to give me options, but not enough to change who I was or how I lived. And that felt right. Anything more would have carried expectations I didn't want. I used it carefully. Paid off debts. Built a cushion. Invested conservatively. No announcements. No visible shifts. Stability wasn't something I needed to prove. What surprised me most was how little I thought about my family once things settled. They drifted from the center of my thoughts to the edges, then faded almost entirely, not because I had forgiven them, not because I was bitter, but because they no longer defined me. I had spent so many years orienting myself around their reactions, anticipating disappointment, managing tension, minimizing my presence. Without that gravitational pull, I had to learn how to stand differently. At first it felt awkward, like using muscles I hadn't relied on before. Then it felt natural. I made choices without rehearsing them. I said no without explaining. I took up space in conversations without apologizing. Small things maybe, but together they formed a life that felt solid under my feet. Once months later I ran into my sibling by chance. A grocery store. An aisle too narrow to avoid each other. We exchanged polite nods. Nothing more. No anger. No familiarity. Just two people acknowledging shared history without reopening it. As I walked away, I didn't feel loss. I felt finality. That night I thought about my grandmother again, not with grief but with gratitude. I realized she had given me something far more valuable than money or protection. She had trusted me to see clearly, to endure without surrendering, to choose the moment when silence had done enough. I finally understood why she never intervened loudly, why she never corrected anyone on my behalf. She wasn't indifferent. She was watching, waiting to see whether I would learn to stand on my own terms. And I had. The justice I received didn't rewrite the past. It didn't heal every wound. It didn't turn my family into something it never was. What it did was simpler and deeper. It returned ownership of my life to me. I no longer measure myself against their approval. I no longer explain my worth. I no longer wait for permission to exist fully. The person who once sat quietly at the edge of every room is gone, not erased, but grown. If there is an ending to this story, it isn't the ruling, the documents, or the inheritance. It's the moment I stopped shrinking and realized that being underestimated had never been my weakness. It had been my cover. And when I finally stood up, calm, quiet, undeniable, there was nothing left to take from me. There is a lesson hidden inside stories like this one that isn't loud, dramatic, or easy to explain. Sometimes the people who survive the longest injustices aren't weak. They are observant. They are learning. They are waiting for the moment when silence becomes a choice instead of a wound. In real life, strength doesn't always look like confrontation. Often it looks like restraint. Like reading carefully when others rush. Like standing still while others underestimate you. Like choosing truth over approval even when the cost is distance. Delayed justice hurts because it asks you to carry pain longer than feels fair. But it also reveals something powerful. When you finally stop shrinking, you don't need revenge to feel whole. You need clarity. You need boundaries. You need the courage to let people misunderstand you if that's the price of not betraying yourself. Not everyone who smiles at you means well. Not every kind word is given freely, and not every family is capable of seeing you clearly. But that does not reduce your worth. It simply means your growth will happen elsewhere, quietly, honestly, and on your own terms. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What part stayed with you the most? Have you ever experienced a moment where staying silent was actually your strength? Share your reflection in the comments. Your story might help someone else feel less alone. And if you believe in stories about quiet endurance, delayed justice, and people finally standing tall after being overlooked, please consider subscribing to this channel. Your support helps these stories reach the people who need them most.